Morning, everybody. It's a real honor to be with you here today. Let me just explain what we're going to do here with the Data Doctor. And this is going to be a monthly series in which I'm going to take a look at frequently asked questions that come into the forum and show you how you can solve that problem. But you too have an opportunity to post questions. You can just reach out to us at our LinkedIn VizConnect channel and post a question. Maybe next month we'll be looking at your question. I do live in Nashville, and it's pretty early in the morning where I am, and I know that you're going to be seeing this at different times of the day. So good morning, good afternoon, whatever fits and is appropriate. I'm a 4-time Tableau ambassador on the forum, so I've seen a lot of questions, and I see the same type of question occurring over and over again. And I want to share 3 of those with you today. The first is one where we have to use scaffolding to reshape the data so that you can actually answer the question that's being asked. The second is the year-over-year or period-over-period calculation. And then the third is the most frequent question that we see out there. We see it many times a day, and that's aggregation errors. You can't mix aggregates and non-aggregates. Let's just jump in here right now when we talk about scaffolding. Scaffolding is only one technique that you can use to reshape your data or reorganize your data. And it's particularly useful in what's known as the to-date problem. And this is a classic problem. It goes back to long before I was involved with Tableau. And the data set that's involved typically has a record, and then it has a start date and an end date. And what the question is that you want to know what happens between those 2 dates. Now, that's a type of question that comes in from people that they might be money managers in a bank. And there's a number of mortgages, and they're looking across the entire portfolio. And what they'd like to know is on a month-by-month basis, what would be their cash flow from all of those investments? Or it could come in the form of this question, and this is a modified question that actually came in to the forum. We had an HR manager, human resources, and he had a number of job requisitions over the course of a year. And for every job rec, he had a start date and an end date or a fill date. And what he wanted to know, he said, look, I want to look down, I want to know how many jobs I filled each month, and I want to know how many jobs were still open. And he was playing around, and he said, I can't get these dates to line up. And maybe you find yourself in the same position, and his question to us was, what's the formula that I need to use? You know, I don't have a formula here. What do I need to do this? So I sat back and I looked and I said, well, wait, if I was doing this with a pencil and a piece of paper, what I'd do is I'd create a calendar, and I'd look at the calendar and I'd start putting each one of these jobs on the calendar. Well, what he needed a calendar also. And we made him a calendar, and the calendar was just very simple. He wanted to look on a monthly basis, so we just looked at the first day of each month, and he just had 1 year worth of data. So I made this in Excel, and you could make it in Excel, or you could use some other tool to make it. And it's just the first day of each month for the calendar year. And then we brought that into Tableau, and we joined it to his Tableau's thinking here for a second. We joined it to his raw data set, the data set that had all the jobs in it. And what we wanted to do is we want every job connected to each date in the scaffold. And to do that, we created a join clause. It's known as a Cartesian join. We use 1 = 1, and every record in his job data set is now connected to each date in the scaffold. And now when we come back and we take a look at the calendar, this is beginning to look like what we want. It's beginning to look like a calendar. We got the scaffold months across the columns, and we can see his jobs listed here. So his first question was, I want to see when I filled each job, and I want to see how many jobs I filled each month. And to do that, we just created a simple expression. This is an LOD expression. I like to use LODs. You may not have to use an LOD here, but I use this for some things we were doing later with him. And all this does is take a look and it says, if the month and date trunc is a date function and it returns the first day of the level of the date that you're looking at. So if the first day of the month on the fill date equals the first date of the month on the scaffold, then record the job ID. And when we bring that to the Viz, sure enough, we can see here that we're seeing all of his dates. We can see that this job was filled in October and that job was filled in October. And if we go down to the bottom and sum this total, we can see how many jobs were filled during each month. Now, his second question was, how many jobs do I still have open? And to use the same approach to do that, we just changed the LOD a little bit, and we take a look to see that if the open date is less than or equal to the scaffold date, and the job fill date is after the scaffold date, then we want to record that the job was still open. And we can bring that to the Viz also. And we can see when jobs were still open. Here's one that was open in October, and it's still open. He's got a null date in there. We put a little null check in there, so this job was still open. And then once again, when we total them, you can see how many jobs were still open. And we can put that on a summary calendar, or we can look at it. We can look at it like this. Now, what he was asking, he said, I need a formula. I need to know how I can get these two dates to know each other. Well, they really don't know each other. They're independent dates. And what he needed was something he didn't have in the data. He needed a calendar. So as an analyst or a developer, sometimes you have to sit back and you have to say, well, what's missing? What's the business question? And what do I need to add to this data set so that we can actually answer that question? And in this case, we had to add a calendar. You saw how we joined it to the to his original data and how we used a Cartesian join to join those. Now, the second example that I want to talk to you about, we see year over year, period over period questions weekly, maybe several times a week, where someone wants to compare this period this year to the same period last year, and what was the percent change and the like. And we certainly see a lot of them in right around the first of the year. And the question usually starts out something like this. Well, I've used a table calculation, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the table calculation here, that would calculate the difference going across the data. And I've got this empty column, and the question usually becomes, well, how do I get rid of that empty column of data? And they probably tried going in here and excluding the data, and they just get a different empty column of data. Well, what's happening is this equation, and we're going to look at it here. I don't know whether you're aware of that. You can just drag that off to the side and open it up, and you can actually see the calculation that Tableau is using. And what it's doing is it's taking the value in the current cell, and then it's looking back one cell and taking the difference in those, and then dividing it by the cell that's back one location. Well, you can't, when you filter data out, like we did over here, when you filter data out, I can filter this out, and you'll see that there's no data left. When you filter data out, the previous cell here, 2020, is not available to use in that calculation. So what Tableau is going to return, it's going to return a null, and you're not going to have the data that you want. Well, whenever I get this question, I always tell the user to use an LOD. And if you were to go out to my blog, you'll see that I've got a year over year and a year to date article out there, and it gives you 3 different ways of doing it. The first way is using the table calculation, but I always tell people to use the LOD because it's the most straightforward way of doing it. And I just want to take a look at there we go. Sorry. I just want to take a look at the calculation that we're going to use here. And I'm going to look at this a couple different ways. First, I've got an order date in here, and all it says is if the year of the order date equals the year of today, so it's this year's data, then sales, and we sum that, and then we look at the order date in the subcategory level. And then we look at last year's data, and when we go to edit that, we're doing essentially the same thing. We're taking a look at the year of the order date, and year of order date returns an integer. And if it equals the year of a year of today minus 1, or in other words, last year, then sales. So I've got this year's sales and I got last year's sales, and we can calculate the percent difference by actually doing the math. We're taking this year's sales, and it's an LOD, so we have to sum it, minus last year's sales divided by last year's sales, and return it as a percentage, and we can get these values here. The other way we see the request come in is we take a look at a value tied to a parameter. And here I've got a parameter that I call the end date, and that's October 8th in 2019. So that's going to be the end date for this. Now, it's kind of important to note that when we're doing a year-over-year calculation, I used today or I use a parameter date. It has to be anchored to a value. You have to know what either the start date is or the end date is. Now we can look at these calculations also, and these are just a little bit different, because here we're going to look at a year to date. And I've written this calculation a little bit different. Once again, we're going to use an LOD at the order date and the subcategory level. And all this does, date trunk year is going to be January 1st for the order date. It's the year of the order date equals the date trunk year. This is the prior year sales. For the parameter date, and I've used data here to back that up 1 year, last year's January, and the date trunk of the day is less than or equal to the date trunk of the parameter date last year. So we're looking at all the dates prior to October 8th, then record the sales. And we've done that here for last year, and you've probably already figured out we've done that for this year. Also, the same data, we're just comparing to the date parameter, and then we can take the percent difference just like we did before, and we can calculate that at the levels that we want, where we take the difference between the two LOD expressions and divide it by last year's date, and you get the percent difference. Now, when you use an LOD, the answer becomes portable. You can use this answer anywhere. I don't have to have subcategory in here, and I don't have to have category in here, and I can still get the values that we're looking for. There is one third type of question we get where people want to take a look on a running basis. They want to look at year over year on a running basis. And I'm going to show you how it's done, and then I'm going to tell you not to do it. And the reason I'm going to tell you not to do it is because it's, in the real world sense, and you'll understand this here in just a minute or two, in a real world sense, it's very difficult to do. I have a data set here, and this is a very, very simple data set, and this is the only case that I would do this in. I have a very simple data set. All I did was take a look at the category level and the sales by year, and I made a copy of that data set and joined it to itself. But I joined it with a join clause that took the year of the order date in the original data set, and in the copy, I've got the year of the order date plus 1. So I've offset the dates by 1 year in this data set. And when I come back and I can look at it, sure enough, I can see that I've got the sales this year and I've got the sales prior year. I can see that they're offset, and I can take the difference between those without any difficulty at all, and I can get those values. I can also go one step further, and this data set includes the quarter, okay? And we're doing the same sort of thing, the year joined to year plus 1, and then I have to join at the quarter level. And when you do that, we can come back and we can look at that data and you can see, well, sure enough, here's 2017, and well, that would be prior year. So these are matching up like they should. And I took the difference in dollars here because it might be a little easier to see that how the difference came about. And that's fine as long as the data set is very simple and it's very solid. And by solid, I mean every cell has a value in it and every cell is represented in the data. But when we get to a real world data set, and this is just the Superstore data, and Superstore data is very complex. It represents data that you'd get from a some sort of like a SAP system or a ERP system that represents your daily sales. And I try to join those two together. And I'm going to go back and I'm just going to show you this one example because it gets very complex in a hurry. It's the year of order date to the year plus one of order date, just like we did before. And we start looking at the real world data and we say, well, okay, this is the sales for this year, and this is the sales for last year, but those values aren't right. Okay, and they're the same value for each one. So I'd have to join them at a different level. And if you start drilling down into this data set, we're going to look at the subcategory level. Tableau is just doing its processing thing. Okay. Take a look at the subcategory level. You can see it's wrong. It's still wrong, and even more complex. You would need to join these data at the grain of the data and then offset it 1 year. And by the grain of the data, I mean the lowest level in the data set that you want to look at. If you wanted to look at customer and you want to look at subcategory, you'd have to be joining at that level. And it's very complex. It's something I wouldn't do. I don't think I'm skilled enough to do that. If you have someone who is an expert with SQL or your database administrator who really knows the data set, they might be able to do that for you. So my recommendation to you is whenever you have a year-over-year calculation, use an LOD expression. It's going to get rid of that problem that you have with the empty cell when you do a table calculation, and it's going to give you a portable answer that you can take and use in summaries, or you can use it anywhere in your workbook. I've got one other example that I want to talk about, and this example, this is the aggregation versus non-aggregation error, and this is a daily problem. We get this probably 10 times a day in questions on the form. It's the most frequent error that we see out there. And I want to talk first about explaining what happens when you bring a measure to the canvas or you bring a measure to your worksheet. That data set, that the Superstore data set that's shipped with your copy of Tableau, and I know they're different around the world, so these numbers might not be exact in your data set. But in my data, there's 10,000 rows of data in that data set. And if I just bring category to the worksheet, and I want the sum, it's going to come as an aggregate. And the default aggregate is sales. So I'm going to get sum of sales versus category. Well, what's happening beneath the worksheet that you're working on and the data table for that specific worksheet is these 10,000 rows of data are being aggregated down to 3. So there's the concept of aggregated data versus non-aggregated data. And if we look at a very simple calculation, this is something that we see all the time. I got sales and I got quantity, and I want to calculate the average or the ASP, as it's referred to, the average selling price, by taking the sum of sales, and I just write quantity, and I'm going to get the aggregation error. It's going to come back and it's going to say, hey, you can't do that. That's you're mixing aggregates and non-aggregates. When we think about what we just looked at, this value, the sum of sales, is those 3 values. This value is those 10,000 records that are sitting out there. So they're at the wrong level. And that's all that message is telling you. It's saying, hey, look, you've got things in your formula there that you can't do the math because they're at different levels. And I can't take 3 records and divide it by 10,000 records and come back with any meaningful answer. Well, that was pretty easy to see. But let's see what happens when we look at how this might look in that same expression we were looking at, where we were looking at year-to-date year-to-date differences, and I was looking at LODs to do that. Oop, I'm sorry. Wrong one. And here, LOD expressions may be at a different level in your workbook, but they're not aggregates, okay? So here what I've done is I've taken the sum of sales for this year's sales, that's this year's LOD, that's the numbers we just looked at, and from that I subtract last year's sales. And I'm going to get that error message again. It's going to say, hey, wait a minute, you can't mix aggregates and non-aggregates, and I'd have to have this as the sum. This is the same formula we just looked at, and when we do that, we get a message down here that says, oh, the calculation is valid. So you can aggregate LOD expressions. Well, let's take a look at what happens when we've got dates involved here. And I'm going to show you what this date difference calculation is. And this expression just looks, I want to count the date difference. I want to determine the difference in dates between the order date and the ship date. And that's what date difference does. It's going to return the number of days between the order date and the ship date. And I want that for each of my orders, okay? So I can bring that out to the Viz, and I've got month of order date out here, and I've got the date difference, and the date difference varies by the month. I don't know what happened in November here, but the date difference varies by month. And then I want to take a look at late orders. And late orders, and I'm just going to change this here real quick. Late orders are any order that's more than 4 days between the two dates. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at the subcategory, the order level, and I'm going to say, if that difference is more than 4, then I want the sum of sales. I want to know what the total sales were. So I know, how many people, not how many people, but how the dollar value of what we're shipping late. And I get this error message again. And I've got an error inside this LOD expression, but I know I've got to have some in there someplace because the value's got to be aggregated. Well, let's take a look at how you would write this thing properly. Now, same expression at the subcategory and the order level. I'm going to take a look, and inside the parentheses, we're going to take a look at if the order date is greater than 4, then record the sales, close that, and then put the summation outside the conditional statement. And we'll find that that works properly. And you can see what the values of those orders were. If you try to put that inside, now we have to come back and have to aggregate each of the dates that you have in the date differences expression. So my recommendation to you is always do it this way, where you're calculating the individual sales and then you sum them in the LOD expression. I've got one more that I want to look at here, and this uses a lookup function. And I think you're familiar with lookup functions. All I've done here in this expression, and the way you would read this function, this is a lookup is a table calculation. And the way you would read this is I want you to go to the sales column, and I want you to look up the previous value. I want to look up minus ones, and we're going to cross the count. So here in 2019, if I look up -1 for furniture, it's that value 157,000, and so on and so forth. So now if I come back and I want to take the difference in those numbers, and I try to write an expression that looks like this. I'm going to get the error message again. And this one's not so obvious. This one says, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? They look like they're at the same level. I don't have a sum in here anyplace. But lookup always returns an aggregate. If you think of that initial example where we were talking about the 10,000 rows of data becoming 3 rows of data, any table calculation is doing the same thing. The table calculation operates at the data table level, aggregates that value. Here, the 157,000 is aggregated from the data table, aggregates that to the level that you're looking at. So this is an aggregate. Sales is not an aggregate. It's still at those 10,000 record level. And we would come back, and now we see we have a valid expression. It was the sales that were not aggregated in this expression. Well, that's what I wanted to cover off with you this morning. Those are the 3 examples that I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something along the way. And once again, if you have questions you'd like to see me address next month, reach out to our LinkedIn channel, or you can reach out to me at my LinkedIn channel. I'm also available on Twitter. This is my blog, and this is Tableau Public. But I want to make mention of one thing. If you have an urgent need, if you need something done right now because you're working on something for business, post your question on the forum. And if you post your question on the forum and you include your workbook with the question and you outline your expectation, you get an answer real fast. Usually within an hour or 2, you'll have an answer. Thank you very much.